How many years of friendship can survive one night of betrayal? What happens when the most trusted house slave discovers her master's plan to sell her children? On August 15, 1841, during Louisiana's grandest summer festival, Celeste used a butter knife to end 6 lives at Magnolia Grove Plantation. For 15 years, she had been like family to the Beauregard household. She delivered their babies, nursed their sick, kept their secrets. But when she overheard their plan to auction her twin sons to pay gambling debts, the woman who had spent her life protecting others became their judge and executioner. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're from and hit that subscribe button for more untold stories. The screaming started in the middle of Master Philippe's toast to prosperity, but by then, Celeste had already driven the silver butter knife deep into Madame Marguerite's throat. Blood sprayed across the white tablecloth like spilled wine as the plantation mistress clutched at the wound, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. The woman who had braided Marguerite's hair that very morning, who had chosen her dress and fastened her pearls, now watched the life drain from her eyes with the cold satisfaction of justice finally served. The Magnolia Grove Summer Festival was supposed to be the social event of the season. 6 plantation families had gathered in the grand ballroom, their children playing on Persian rugs, while the adults celebrated another profitable harvest. Chinese lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the sound of violins mixed with laughter and the clink of crystal glasses. Nobody noticed Celeste moving silently between the guests, refilling wine glasses and collecting empty plates. After 15 years of invisible service, she had perfected the art of being seen but never truly observed. But tonight was different. Tonight, Celeste moved with the precision of a woman who had already accepted her fate. She had spent 3 sleepless days planning this moment, ever since she overheard Philippe and his brother-in-law discussing the sale of her twin sons, Marcus and Jerome, to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The boys were only 12, still children who called her mama, and believed she could protect them from anything. They had no idea that tomorrow morning, before the sun rose, they would be chained and loaded onto a wagon bound for a place where children worked themselves to death in fields that stretched beyond the horizon. The conversation had happened in Philippe's study 3 nights ago. Celeste was dusting the bookshelves when the men entered, too drunk on brandy to notice her presence. Philippe owed gambling debts to dangerous men in New Orleans, debts that threatened not just his plantation but his life. The twins were young, strong, and would fetch a premium price at auction. It was business, Philippe had said with a shrug, nothing personal. His brother-in-law had laughed and suggested they could always breed more slaves to replace them. Celeste had continued dusting, her hands steady even as her heart shattered into pieces sharp enough to cut. She had raised those boys from birth, nursed them through fevers, taught them to read in secret, promised them that their lives would be different somehow. She had lied to herself and to them, believing that her special relationship with the Beauregard family would protect her children. She had been Marguerite's closest companion during her difficult pregnancies, had saved little Claire's life during the yellow fever outbreak, had kept Philippe's affair with the neighbor's wife secret for years. She thought loyalty earned protection. She learned it only earned exploitation. The first death was almost gentle. Marguerite was laughing at something Philippe had said when Celeste approached from behind. The blade slid between the vertebrae with surgical precision, severing the spinal cord instantly. Marguerite's laugh died mid-note, replaced by a wet gurgling sound as she collapsed forward into her soup. The other guests thought she had fainted until they saw the blood spreading across the white linen tablecloth like a crimson flower blooming in snow. Philippe was the second to die, and his death was not gentle at all. When he saw his wife's body, he lurched toward Celeste with rage and disbelief written across his face. "How could you?" he screamed. "After everything we've done for you, after all the kindness we've shown." But Celeste was no longer the grateful house slave who had smiled and curtsied for 15 years. She was a mother whose children were about to be stolen, and her fury burned hotter than any plantation fire. The knife found his stomach first, sliding between his ribs with a wet sound that silenced the screaming. Philippe doubled over, clutching at the wound, his white shirt blooming red. "This is for Marcus," Celeste whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. She pulled the knife free and struck again, higher this time, piercing his lung. "And this is for Jerome." Philippe fell to his knees, blood foaming at his lips, looking up at the woman who had been like a sister to his wife, with eyes that couldn't comprehend what was happening. The other guests were frozen in horror and confusion. These were people who had known Celeste for years, who had trusted her with their children, their secrets, their lives. She had delivered half their babies, nursed them through illnesses, been present at their most vulnerable moments. The idea that she could be dangerous had never occurred to them. They saw her as part of the furniture, reliable and harmless as a faithful dog. That misconception would cost them everything. Mr. Laurent was next, the neighbor who had suggested breeding more slaves to replace the twins. He was backing toward the door, his face pale with terror when Celeste caught him. The knife went into his back, just below the shoulder blade, piercing his heart from behind. He fell forward onto the marble floor, his body convulsing once before going still. 3 down, 3 to go, and the night was still young. The surviving guests finally broke from their paralysis and began to run. Mrs. Lawrence screamed for help as she fled toward the staircase, her silk dress trailing behind her like a river of blue. Behind her, Mr. and Mrs. Devereaux stumbled over chairs and tables in their panic, crystal glasses shattering on the floor as they knocked over a serving cart. The children, sensing danger but not understanding it, began to cry in high, frightened voices that mixed with the screams of their parents. But Celeste was faster than fear. She caught Mrs. Laurent at the bottom of the stairs, grabbing her by the hair and pulling her backward. The woman's screams echoed off the high ceiling as the knife found her throat, silencing her voice forever. Her blood painted the white marble steps red, creating a slippery cascade that would later be called the Devil's Waterfall by the slaves who found the bodies. The Devereaux couple had almost reached the front door when Celeste caught up with them. Mr. Devereaux pushed his wife behind him, trying to shield her with his body, but Celeste was beyond mercy now. The knife found him first, sliding between his ribs and puncturing his lung. He gasped and wheezed, blood bubbling from his mouth as he tried to speak. His wife was sobbing, begging for her life, promising she would free all her slaves if Celeste would just spare her. But promises from white lips had never meant anything on a plantation, and they meant nothing now. Mrs. Devereaux died quickly, the knife finding her heart on the first strike. She fell beside her husband, their hands touching in death as they had in life. The grand ballroom of Magnolia Grove, which had hosted countless celebrations and social gatherings, was now a charnel house decorated with the finest crystal and the bloodiest revenge Louisiana had ever seen. The children had huddled together in the corner, too terrified to move or speak. They stared at Celeste with wide, uncomprehending eyes, seeing her transform from the gentle woman who had served them cookies and milk into something dark and terrible. But she didn't approach them. These children were innocent of their parents' crimes, and even in her rage, Celeste understood the difference between justice and murder. Instead, she walked calmly to the center of the room, stepping carefully around the bodies of people who had shared her life for 15 years. The Chinese lanterns still cast their warm glow, the violins had fallen silent, and the only sound was the gentle dripping of blood onto marble. Celeste sat down in Marguerite's chair, still holding the bloody knife, and waited for the consequences of her choices to arrive. She thought about Marcus and Jerome, probably asleep in their narrow beds, dreaming of a future they would never see. She thought about the years she had spent believing that kindness and loyalty would protect them, that being indispensable would make them safe. She had been wrong about everything, but she was right about one thing: her children would never be sold. Tomorrow morning, when the slave traders came looking for 2 healthy boys, they would find only empty beds and a plantation soaked in blood. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 15 years learning to read the Beauregard family's moods, anticipating their needs, making herself invaluable to their comfort and security. Those same skills had taught her how to move unseen through their world, how to strike when they were most vulnerable, how to turn their trust into a weapon against them. They had trained their own executioner without ever realizing it. Outside, she could hear voices approaching, servants and neighbors drawn by the screaming. Soon, they would break down the doors and find the massacre. They would drag her away in chains, try her in a courthouse where her testimony wouldn't be allowed, and hang her in a public square while crowds cheered. But first, they would have to explain to the world how one trusted house slave had murdered 6 white plantation owners in their own home. They would have to admit that the people they owned were capable of perfect, calculated revenge. The first person to enter the ballroom was Thomas, the head stable hand, drawn by the children's terrified sobbing that echoed through the mansion's halls like the cries of wounded animals. He pushed open the heavy oak doors expecting to find a simple accident, perhaps a fallen chandelier or spilled wine, but instead discovered a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his short life. 6 bodies lay scattered across the marble floor like broken dolls, their blood creating abstract patterns that no artist would dare paint. And in the center of it all sat Celeste, still as a statue, the bloody knife resting in her lap like a twisted scepter of authority. Thomas stumbled backward, his hand flying to cover his mouth as bile rose in his throat. He had seen death before, had watched fellow slaves beaten until they stopped breathing, had helped bury children who worked themselves into early graves. But this was different. This was white blood on white marble, and that made it the kind of death that would bring armies of vengeful men with ropes and torches. He looked at Celeste, this woman he had known for years, who had sewn his torn shirts and bandaged his wounds after whippings, and couldn't reconcile the gentle healer with the killer sitting calmly among the corpses. Celeste met his gaze without flinching, her dark eyes holding a peace that seemed impossible given the carnage surrounding her. She had crossed a line that no slave was supposed to cross and survive to tell about it, even if only for a few more hours. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she used when comforting sick children, "you need to take Marcus and Jerome far from here. Tonight. Before the sun rises and before anyone thinks to look for them." The stable hand's eyes widened as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. The twins, Celeste's boys who helped him feed the horses and clean the stalls, were the reason for this massacre. Someone had planned to sell them, and their mother had chosen blood over separation. Thomas had children of his own, hidden in the slave quarters, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would have done the same thing if anyone had tried to take them. The knowledge terrified him because it meant he understood Celeste's choice, and understanding made him complicit in her crime. But there was no time for moral debates or philosophical discussions about the nature of justice under slavery. Already, Thomas could hear voices approaching from different parts of the mansion, house slaves and field hands drawn by the commotion, their footsteps echoing off the walls like drumbeats announcing the end of the world. Once they saw what Celeste had done, once word spread beyond the plantation boundaries, every slave in Louisiana would be suspect. The white community would respond with a fury that would make previous punishments look like gentle corrections. Thomas made his choice in the space between heartbeats. He sprinted from the ballroom, leaving Celeste alone with the dead, and ran through the mansion's corridors toward the slave quarters. Behind him, he could hear other servants discovering the bodies, their screams joining the children's cries in a symphony of horror that would wake the entire parish. He had perhaps minutes before someone thought to secure the quarters, before they began rounding up every slave for questioning and punishment. Marcus and Jerome were asleep in their narrow beds, their young faces peaceful in the moonlight streaming through the single window. Thomas shook them awake roughly, his hands trembling with urgency and fear. "You boys need to get up right now," he whispered harshly. "Your mama says you need to run far and fast and you can't ever come back here." The twins, groggy and confused, tried to ask questions, but Thomas cut them off. "There's no time for explanations." Take nothing but the clothes on your backs and follow me to the bayou. I know people who can get you north, but we have to leave now." The boys had inherited their mother's intelligence, and they recognized the tone of absolute emergency in Thomas's voice. They had lived on a plantation long enough to know that sudden nighttime departures usually meant someone's life was in immediate danger. They dressed quickly and silently, their hearts pounding with fear they didn't yet understand. As they crept through the quarters, other slaves watched from doorways and windows, their faces shadowed with knowledge of disaster approaching like a hurricane no one could outrun. At the edge of the plantation, where cultivated fields gave way to wild bayou, Thomas stopped and pulled the boys close. "Your mama did something tonight, something that means you can never come home again," he told them, his voice breaking with emotion. "She did it to protect you, to keep you from being sold away from here. You understand what that means?" The twins nodded solemnly, their childhood ending in the space of that single conversation. They had always known this day might come, had heard whispered stories of families torn apart by sales and auctions, but they had believed their mother's position in the big house would protect them. Thomas led them deeper into the bayou, where cypress trees draped in Spanish moss created a cathedral of shadows and secrets. He knew these waterways like a spider knows its web, had used them to help other runaway slaves disappear into the Louisiana wilderness. The twins followed him without complaint, their bare feet silent on the muddy banks, their eyes adjusting to the darkness that would be their companion for weeks to come. Behind them, the plantation grew brighter as lanterns and torches were lit, as men on horseback arrived to investigate the massacre, as the machinery of white vengeance began to turn with terrible efficiency. Back in the ballroom, Celeste remained seated among the dead, her composure unshaken even as chaos erupted around her. More servants had discovered the bodies now, their horrified voices creating an echo chamber of disbelief and terror. Some fled immediately, understanding that proximity to such violence made them suspects. Others stood frozen, unable to process the sight of their mistress and master reduced to bleeding meat on their own marble floor. A few approached Celeste cautiously, as if she might transform into something even more dangerous than she had already proven to be. Sarah, the youngest house girl, crept forward with tears streaming down her face. "Celeste," she whispered, "why did you do this? They gonna kill us all now. Every slave on this plantation, maybe every slave in the parish. They gonna think we all part of some uprising." The girl was right, and Celeste knew it. Her personal act of vengeance would bring collective punishment to people who had nothing to do with her choice. But she had passed the point where collective consequences mattered more than her children's freedom. "I did what any mother would do," Celeste replied calmly, her blood-stained hands folded in her lap like she was sitting in church instead of surrounded by corpses. "They were going to sell Marcus and Jerome tomorrow morning, ship them off to Mississippi to work cotton fields until they died. I couldn't let that happen, not when I had the power to stop it." The other slaves understood the logic even as they feared the consequences. Every one of them had children, siblings, parents who could be sold at a moment's notice. Every one of them lived with the knowledge that love was a luxury they couldn't afford, because it made them vulnerable to exactly this kind of impossible choice. The sound of galloping horses grew louder, accompanied by the baying of bloodhounds and the shouts of armed men converging on Magnolia Grove from every direction. Word of the massacre had spread faster than wildfire, carried by fleeing servants and neighboring planters who had seen the lights and heard the screaming. Within hours, every white man within 50 miles would be armed and ready to exact vengeance for this unprecedented attack on the social order that governed their world. Sheriff William Broussard arrived first, his face grim with the knowledge that this night would change everything. He had been dealing with runaway slaves and minor infractions for 20 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight that greeted him in the Beauregard ballroom. 6 prominent citizens, pillars of the community, lay butchered by a woman they had trusted with their lives. It was every slave owner's nightmare made real, proof that the people they owned were capable of perfect, calculated murder. Browser drew his pistol but didn't aim it, recognizing that Celeste posed no immediate threat. She had made no attempt to flee or resist, had simply waited for judgment to arrive with the patience of someone who had already accepted her fate. He studied her face, searching for signs of madness or drugs, some explanation for how a trusted house slave could transform into a cold-blooded killer. But Celeste's eyes held only the calm certainty of someone who had done exactly what needed to be done. Consequences be damned. The sheriff's deputies spread throughout the mansion, securing the scene and rounding up the surviving slaves for questioning. They moved with the nervous energy of men who had suddenly realized their world was far more dangerous than they had imagined. If Celeste could do this, if 15 years of loyalty and service could mask this kind of potential for violence, then every slave was a possible assassin waiting for the right moment to strike. The foundation of their society, built on the assumption that enslaved people were broken and controllable, had cracked wide open. Other planters began arriving as dawn approached, their faces pale with fury and fear. They looked at the bodies of their friends and neighbors, then at Celeste sitting serenely among the carnage, and saw the collapse of everything they had built their lives around. This wasn't just murder, it was revolution in miniature, a declaration that the people they owned were willing to kill rather than submit to certain injustices. The implications were staggering and terrifying. But even as they planned their response, even as they organized posses to hunt down every runaway slave in the parish, they couldn't escape one troubling fact. Celeste had outmaneuvered them completely. She had identified their weakness, planned her attack with surgical precision, and executed it flawlessly while they drank wine and celebrated their prosperity. The woman they had dismissed as harmless property had proven herself more dangerous than any of them, and that knowledge would poison their sense of security forever. The trial lasted exactly 17 minutes, but the effects would ripple through Louisiana for decades. Judge Harrison Montgomery sat behind his mahogany bench in the parish courthouse, his face a mask of cold fury as he stared down at Celeste, who stood in shackles before him with the same unbreakable composure she had maintained since the night of the massacre. The courtroom was packed with every white planter within 100 miles, their faces twisted with rage and fear, demanding blood for blood. But beneath their anger lay something deeper and more dangerous, the terrifying recognition that their entire way of life hung by threads thinner than they had ever imagined. No lawyer would represent Celeste, not that it mattered. Louisiana law prohibited enslaved people from testifying in their own defense, from calling witnesses, from presenting evidence. The trial was theater, a public ritual designed to restore the illusion of white control and black submission. But even theater requires actors who play their assigned roles, and Celeste refused to perform the part of the repentant slave begging for mercy she would never receive. When Judge Montgomery asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Celeste lifted her chin and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. I am guilty of loving my children more than I feared your laws. I am guilty of believing that some bonds are stronger than chains. I am guilty of proving that those you call property are capable of perfect justice. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I accept your judgment gladly. The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. This was not the broken confession they expected, not the performance of shame and regret that would validate their righteousness. This was a declaration of war disguised as an acceptance of defeat, and every person in that courtroom understood its implications. Celeste had not just killed 6 people, she had shattered the fundamental lie that slavery depended on, the fiction that enslaved people accepted their bondage willingly. Judge Montgomery's gavel fell like thunder. Death by hanging, to be carried out at sunset today in the public square, so that all might witness the price of rebellion. But even as he pronounced the sentence, his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his own uncertainty. How do you execute someone who has already won the only victory that mattered to them? How do you intimidate people who have proven they fear separation from their families more than they fear death? While Celeste sat in her cell awaiting execution, Marcus and Jerome moved deeper into the bayou under Thomas's careful guidance. The stable hand had kept his word, leading them through a network of safe houses and hidden camps maintained by runaway slaves and sympathetic free people of color. The twins had aged years in the span of days, their childhood innocence burned away by the knowledge of what their mother had sacrificed for their freedom. They spoke little during their journey, but their eyes held a hardness that would never completely fade. The deeper they traveled into the wilderness, the more they encountered others fleeing the aftermath of the massacre. Paranoid planters throughout the region had begun selling off their most trusted house slaves, convinced that loyalty was a mask hiding murderous intent. Families were being torn apart preemptively, children sold before they could be used as leverage against their parents, elderly slaves disposed of because their years of faithful service now seemed like evidence of elaborate deception. The irony was not lost on Thomas as he watched plantation after plantation empty their quarters of anyone who might pose a threat. Celeste's act of individual revenge had accomplished what no organized rebellion could have achieved. It had made white Louisiana afraid of their own shadows, suspicious of every smile, every gesture of apparent submission. The economic disruption alone would cost the region millions as planters chose security over productivity, fear over profit. Back in town, the public square filled with spectators hours before the scheduled execution. They came from parishes across southern Louisiana, drawn by morbid curiosity and the promise of witnessing justice served. But as the afternoon wore on, and strange moods settled over the crowd, the usual carnival atmosphere that accompanied public hangings was notably absent, replaced by a tense silence that seemed to press down on everyone present like humid air before a storm. The problem was Celeste herself. Even chained and marched to the scaffold, she displayed none of the terror or desperation that crowds expected from condemned criminals. She walked with her head high, her steps steady, looking more like a queen approaching her coronation than a slave walking to her death. The effect was profoundly unsettling to observers who had come expecting to see justice triumph over evil, but instead witnessed something that looked disturbingly like martyrdom. Sheriff Broussard climbed the scaffold steps beside her, his face pale and drawn. He had overseen dozens of executions during his career, but never one that felt like this. The condemned usually begged for mercy, proclaimed their innocence, or broke down in tears at the sight of the noose. Celeste did none of these things. She surveyed the crowd with calm interest, as if she were attending a social gathering rather than her own execution. The sheriff cleared his throat and began to read the charges, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the restless crowd. Murder in the first degree of Philippe Beauregard, Marguerite Beauregard, Henry Laurent, Marie Laurent, Claude Devereaux, and Isabelle Devereaux. The penalty prescribed by law is death by hanging until dead. But the words sounded hollow even to him, empty legal formalities that failed to capture the magnitude of what had really happened in that ballroom. As the noose was placed around her neck, Celeste spoke one final time, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite the crowd's size. "My children are free," she said simply. "That is all that matters. Everything else is just theater." The words sent a chill through the assembled spectators because they recognized the truth in them. This execution would not undo the massacre, would not restore the dead to life, would not erase the knowledge that trusted slaves could become perfect killers when pushed beyond endurance. The trapdoor opened with a wooden groan that seemed to echo through the entire parish. Celeste's body dropped and went still, her neck snapping cleanly. But her death solved nothing and changed everything. Within weeks, paranoid planters began implementing new security measures that would define Louisiana slavery for the remaining decades before the Civil War. House slaves were rotated frequently to prevent emotional attachments. Cooking duties were shared among multiple people to eliminate the possibility of systematic poisoning. Children were separated from their parents at earlier ages to reduce the leverage that could be used to motivate rebellion. But these measures came at enormous cost, both economic and psychological. The efficiency that had made Louisiana plantations profitable depended on trust, on the illusion that enslaved people were willing participants in their own bondage. Celeste had shattered that illusion permanently, forcing planters to acknowledge that their prosperity was built on a foundation of barely contained violence that could explode at any moment. Word of the massacre spread far beyond Louisiana, carried by newspapers and traveling merchants to slave communities throughout the South. In Virginia, tobacco fields and Georgia cotton plantations, in South Carolina rice paddies and Tennessee farms, enslaved people whispered the story of Celeste and her butter knife, of the woman who chose blood over separation, death over submission. The tale grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming inspiration, becoming proof that resistance was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. Meanwhile, Marcus and Jerome continued their journey northward, guided by conductors on the Underground Railroad who had heard their story and understood its significance. The twins carried more than just their freedom. They carried the memory of their mother's sacrifice, the knowledge that someone had loved them enough to die for their liberty. That knowledge would sustain them through the hardships ahead, through the years of hiding and running, through the constant fear of recapture. They eventually reached Canada, where they lived under assumed names and built new lives far from the bayous of Louisiana. Marcus became a teacher, passing on literacy to other freed slaves and refugees. Jerome learned carpentry, building homes for families who had never dreamed of owning property. Both married and had children, ensuring that Celeste's bloodline would continue in freedom rather than bondage. But they never forgot the woman who had given them that freedom, never stopped telling the story of the summer festival massacre to anyone who would listen. They spoke of their mother not as a murderer but as a liberator, not as a criminal but as a hero who had refused to let her children be sold into hell. Their version of events gradually replaced the official narrative, transforming Celeste from a cautionary tale about rebellious slaves into an inspiration for parents everywhere who faced impossible choices. Years later, when the Civil War finally ended slavery in Louisiana, former slaves would gather at the site of the old Magnolia Grove plantation, which had been abandoned and allowed to decay after the massacre. They would tell stories about Celeste and her butter knife, about the night when 6 masters died and 2 children found freedom. The stories varied in details but never in their central message. Love is stronger than chains, and some bonds cannot be broken by any law or custom. The plantation house itself became a sort of shrine, its empty rooms echoing with whispered prayers and quiet songs. Wildflowers grew through cracks in the marble floor where blood had once pooled, and Spanish moss draped the broken windows like mourning veils. The grand ballroom where the massacre occurred was avoided by most visitors, but mothers would sometimes bring their children there to tell them about the woman who had loved her sons enough to kill for them, to die for them, to ensure they would grow up free. In death, Celeste accomplished what she could never have achieved in life. She became a symbol of resistance that no amount of violence could destroy, a reminder that enslaved people were not broken property, but human beings capable of perfect love and terrible vengeance. Her story spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in the hearts of people who had never known her name but understood her choice completely. The butter knife she used that night was kept as evidence until the courthouse burned down in 1863, consumed by fire set during Union occupation. But by then, the weapon had become irrelevant. The real instrument of destruction had been love itself, a mother's love that refused to accept the unacceptable, that chose violence over separation, death over surrender. That kind of love could not be destroyed by judges or juries, could not be intimidated by threats or executions, could not be contained by any law written by human hands. Today, historians debate whether Celeste's actions helped or hindered the cause of abolition, whether individual acts of violence advanced or set back the struggle for freedom. But such debates miss the point entirely. Celeste did not act to change history or advance a political cause. She acted as a mother protecting her children, using the only power available to someone who had no power at all. That her choice had consequences far beyond her intentions only proves that love, even desperate love, even violent love, can move mountains and change worlds. The massacre at Magnolia Grove Plantation stands as a testament to the power of human bonds that no system of oppression can completely sever. It reminds us that beneath every act of historical violence lies a human story, a moment when someone decided that some things are worth dying for, that some loves are stronger than fear. Celeste's story continues to resonate because it speaks to something fundamental about the human spirit. The refusal to accept that those we love can be taken from us without consequence, the insistence that even the powerless have power when they choose to use it, the knowledge that love itself can be a weapon when wielded with sufficient determination. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold histories that reveal the human drama behind historical events. Share this video with others who need to hear these stories, and let us know in the comments what other forgotten tales you'd like us to explore. These stories matter because they remind us that history is not just about dates and battles, but about individual choices that echo through generations.